The preacher's Bible was already open when Winifred Doyle screamed his name into the white mouth of the storm. "Jasper Slater, if you walk out that door, I will never forgive you." Her voice cracked on the last word, swallowed almost immediately by the roar of wind battering the walls of the tiny waystation. Snow drove itself sideways through every gap in the planks, and the single oil lamp on the table threw wild shadows across the faces of the three people standing inside that shuddering room. Winifred stood with her back against the far wall, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks from where she had fought through the blizzard to get here. Her green eyes were burning with something that was equal parts fury and terror, because she had ridden 40 miles in a killing storm to stop a man she barely knew from disappearing forever, and now that she had found him, she still was not certain she could make him stay. Jasper stood at the door with his hand on the iron latch. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the red rock country of Utah. He wore a buffalo coat dusted white with snow, and his dark eyes were filled with the particular anguish of a man who has made a decision that is destroying him from the inside out. Between them stood a third figure. Old Elias Cobb, the wandering preacher, who traveled the Wyoming territory with nothing but a mule, a Bible, and the unshakable conviction that the Lord worked his most important business in the worst weather. He was watching the two of them with the calm expression of a man who has witnessed this exact kind of recklessness before and has learned to trust it. "I have a dark past that would ruin you," Jasper said. His voice was low and controlled, the kind of control that costs everything. "You deserve to know that before any words get said that cannot be unsaid." "Tell me," Winifred said. She did not move from the wall, she did not flinch. "Tell me the worst of it and let me decide." The storm screamed around the building like something that wanted to be let in. And that was the moment, that precise and terrible and electric moment, that neither of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. It was the moment everything that came before and everything that would come after balanced on a single edge. Winifred Doyle did not yet know that she would say yes before morning. Jasper Slater did not yet know that his secrets would not destroy her. And Elias Cobb simply turned to the page he needed, smoothed it with his thumb, and waited with the patience of mountains. To understand how three people came to stand in a waystation in Wyoming in the blizzard of November 1879, you had to go back 6 weeks, to a town called Harlan's Creek. Harlan's Creek was not a town that had been built so much as one that had accumulated. It sat in a shallow bowl of land between the Bighorn foothills and the long grass plains, and it was the kind of place where people stopped either because they were tired or because they were hiding. The main street was wide enough for 2 freight wagons to pass without argument, and it held a general store, a feed and grain, a hotel that also served as the saloon, and a small white church that needed paint. The church had needed paint for 3 years because the previous pastor had left in disgrace, and the congregation had been managing itself since then with rotating lay readers and a great deal of mutual suspicion about who would have to pay for the paint. Winifred Doyle had arrived in Harlan's Creek 14 months before the blizzard, in the back of a freight wagon, with $23, a carpetbag, a box of her dead mother's books, and a letter of introduction to the school board from a teacher's college in Ohio. She was 26 years old, well-spoken, possessed of an exceptional memory for mathematics and an equally exceptional temper when she felt an injustice being committed, and she had come west for the same reason many women came west in those years, because the East had run out of room for the person she actually was. She had been engaged once in Columbus. The man's name was not worth recording. He had wanted a woman who would agree with him, and Winifred had not been able to manage it for longer than 3 weeks before she began pointing out, respectfully at first and then with increasing precision, exactly where his logic failed. He had called it unwomanly. She had called it arithmetic. They had parted with mutual relief, though his family had made sure the story traveled ahead of her in certain social circles, and so Winifred had simply gone further west than those circles could reach. The school in Harlan's Creek had 12 students between the ages of 6 and 15. Winifred taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, some basic geography, and a strong conviction that the world rewarded careful thinking. She was strict and she was fair, and the children adored her in the particular way children adore a teacher who takes them seriously, which is to say, fiercely and sometimes inconveniently. She had been happy enough in Harlan's Creek. Happy enough was not the same as fully alive, but she had not expected to find fully alive in Wyoming. She had expected to find useful, and she had found that. It was enough. She told herself regularly that it was enough. Jasper Slater came to Harlan's Creek on a Tuesday in early October, riding a Grullo horse and leading a pack mule. He came from the direction of the mountains, which meant he had come across the pass rather than up the valley road, which was the harder route, and the one most people only chose if they were in a hurry or if they had a reason to avoid the valley settlements. Winifred noticed him because she noticed most things. She was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when he rode past, and she watched him with the frank appraisal she applied to all new arrivals, which was a habit she had developed as a survival skill. He was perhaps 30 years old. He sat a horse the way men sat horses when riding was as natural to them as breathing. He had the look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, and the particular set to his mouth that suggested he did not spend much of that time laughing. He stopped at the general store. He bought flour, salt, coffee, cartridges for a Winchester rifle, and a new canteen. He paid in coin, asked no questions, and declined an invitation from old Harve Delacroix at the counter to stay for supper. He was at the store for perhaps 20 minutes. Then he rode out the other end of town, headed east toward the lined shacks on the Delaney Range. Winifred went back to sweeping and thought nothing more about it. She thought nothing more about it until 3 days later, when Tom Delaney came into the general store while she was buying lamp oil and told Harve that he had hired a new range hand named Slater, who had come with the strongest reference Tom had ever read in his life, from a man named Colonel Harker out of Cheyenne, and that Slater had taken one look at the north pasture fence and repaired 300 yards of it in a single afternoon without being asked. Winifred filed this information in the part of her mind where she kept things that were interesting without yet being important. She would have kept filing it there indefinitely, except that 3 days after that, she witnessed something that changed the category. She was walking home from school, cutting across the edge of the Delaney property the way she sometimes did to shorten the trip, when she came around the corner of the equipment barn and found Jasper Slater crouched in the dirt beside a young boy of about 10, who was crying with the silent, shoulder-shaking intensity of someone who had been crying for a long time and was trying to hide it. The boy was Danny Flores, who was one of Winifred's students. He was the youngest of the Flores family, who worked the small kitchen garden operation on the south end of town. He was bright and serious, and had a left hand that trembled sometimes from an old injury, which some of the crueler boys used against him. What Jasper Slater was doing was this. He had picked up a small carved wooden horse from the ground beside Danny, which had clearly been thrown or dropped or knocked into the mud, and he was cleaning it carefully with the edge of his bandana, and he was saying something too low for Winifred to hear from 20 feet away. Danny looked up at him with enormous wet eyes and then, slowly, nodded at something. Jasper handed the horse back. Then he put a hand briefly and gently on Danny's shoulder, just once, and stood up and walked toward the barn as if the whole thing had been nothing at all. Danny wiped his face, tucked the horse in his pocket, and walked away in the opposite direction with his chin up. Winifred stood behind the equipment barn and felt something she had not felt in quite some time. It was the specific sensation of noticing, with reluctant and inconvenient certainty, that a person you have barely met has more dimension to them than they appeared to. It was the sensation of beginning to pay attention in a way that was different from her usual categorical attention, and she did not entirely welcome it. She went home and made supper and told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. She spoke to him for the first time 4 days later, at the church social that Mabel Hendricks organized every second Saturday. The church socials were mandatory in the social sense of the word, meaning that anyone who skipped them without a documented illness found themselves receiving visits from Mabel the following morning, which was generally considered worse than attending. Jasper Slater came because Tom Delaney told all his hands to come, and he stood at the edge of the gathering with a plate of food he was eating with the air of a man fulfilling an obligation, which Winifred found immediately recognizable because she was standing 6 feet from him doing the same thing. "You are the one who fixed the schoolhouse window," she said, without preamble. He looked at her. His eyes were darker than she had expected, a kind of deep brown that was almost black, and they were attentive in a way that suggested nothing he saw was filed away carelessly. "The glass was cracked," he said. "The cold will be bad in another few weeks." "I know," she said. "I was going to ask the school board for funds at the December meeting. You saved me a winter of arguing. I had the glass from a broken frame in the barn." "Still," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. They stood in silence for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence which surprised her, because silence with strangers was almost always uncomfortable. "You taught the florist boy," he said. "It was not a question. I teach all the children in the district." He showed me a geography exercise. He had drawn a map of the Oregon Trail with distances marked at intervals. Something moved briefly behind his eyes, too fast for her to name it. He was proud of it. "He should be proud of it," Winifred said. "It took him 4 evenings to get the distances accurate." Jasper Slater looked at her then with a directness that was slightly startling. "You know he gets trouble from the other boys because of his hand." "I know," she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice, the one that appeared when she was speaking about an injustice she had not yet been able to fully correct. "I have addressed it repeatedly. I am still addressing it." "I know you are," he said. "He told me." There was something in the way he said it that settled in her chest like a warm coal and stayed there. He said it without flattery, without softness, simply as a statement of observed fact. She found that she trusted it more than she would have trusted a compliment. They spoke for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular. "He came from Utah," he said when she asked. "He had been working ranches for several years. He did not volunteer more than that." She did not push, because she recognized the shape of a person who would share when they were ready and close up entirely if they were pressed. When she walked home that night, the night air was cold enough to make her breath cloud, and the stars were so bright they seemed almost aggressive, and she walked with the feeling of a person who has set one foot on a different kind of road without quite having decided to yet. The next 3 weeks were composed of small moments that accumulated like snowfall, each one individually inconsequential and collectively transforming the landscape. He came to the school twice to fix things without being asked, once to brace a foundation beam that had shifted, and once to clear ice from the water barrel. Both times he arrived before school started and was gone before the children came. Winifred knew because she arrived early herself, and she started arriving earlier, though she told herself this was simply because she liked the quiet of the classroom in the morning. They spoke at the general store on a Wednesday morning when they arrived at the same moment and both reached for the same bolt of information at the same time, which was the week-old newspaper Harv kept on the counter that people borrowed and returned. He gestured for her to take it. She offered to share it. They ended up reading different sections at opposite ends of Harv's counter for 45 minutes. And twice, they passed their respective sections across to the other when they came across something worth discussing. The newspaper was full of the usual things: the completion of the transcontinental telegraph, disputes over grazing rights, an editorial from Cheyenne about the new state constitution, a letter from a woman in Laramie describing what she called the particular loneliness of the frontier, which Winifred read twice. She did not tell Jasper she read it twice. She noticed him reading the article about grazing rights with a focused attention that told her He had a specific interest in the topic beyond casual curiosity, but she did not ask about it then. She asked about it 2 weeks later, when they had somehow developed the habit of walking the same direction from the store on Wednesday mornings, which was explained easily by the fact that the school and the Delaney Ranch entrance were both east of the main street, and which both of them acknowledged meant nothing beyond geographical coincidence with a seriousness that would have been transparent to anyone watching, except that nobody in Harlan's Creek was watching yet. Because it had not yet become a thing that warranted watching. The grazing rights article, she said on that second Wednesday. You read it very carefully. A pause, not evasion, she decided. More like a man calculating how much truth to invest in a given moment. There is a legal dispute in the county south of here, he said at last, between a large cattle outfit and several smaller family operations. The large outfit has been using tactics that are not strictly legal to drive the small ones out. You have a stake in it. He was quiet for 4 steps. The road was frosted and the air smelled of pine and coming winter. My family had a homestead in Utah, he said. When I was 17, a larger operation wanted the water rights. They used lawyers and pressure and a few other things that were harder to name. His voice was even, but it was not neutral. Under the evenness there was something old and carefully maintained, the way scar tissue is careful. We lost the homestead. My father never recovered from it. My mother did, but it took years. Winifred absorbed this. She understood now what she had seen in his face when he read that article. She understood the careful way he held his words around it. Is that why you move? She asked, and then felt the question was too direct and started to qualify it. Partly, he said before she could qualify it. He glanced at her sideways. You are not a person who flinches from a question. I teach children. You learn to ask clearly or you spend all day getting the answer to something you didn't ask. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one, and Winifred felt it in the region of her sternum in a way that was both pleasant and mildly alarming. They reached the point where their paths diverged. He tipped his hat. She said good morning. She walked the remaining distance to the school with the specific awareness of a woman who is refusing to think about something, which is of course the most active and consuming form of thinking about it. It was the following Tuesday that the situation with Harris Colt emerged, and it was this situation that removed all possibility of Winifred continuing to pretend that Jasper Slater was simply a geographically convenient acquaintance. Harris Colt was 42 years old and owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and he had been making approaches to Winifred with the regularity and subtlety of a man who was accustomed to acquiring things he wanted by simply continuing to pursue them until they yielded. He had started with social attentions at church events, then progressed to public offers to drive her to and from town gatherings, and had now arrived at the stage of appearing unannounced at the school in the early evenings with gifts she had not asked for and did not want, most recently a bolt of green fabric that he had said matched her eyes. Winifred had declined every advance with consistent clarity. Harris Colt either did not understand her clarity or had decided that it was a form of modesty rather than a genuine refusal, which was an interpretation she found both exhausting and infuriating. The situation on that Tuesday was this. She was alone in the schoolhouse after the students had gone, grading arithmetic exercises, when Harris Colt appeared in the doorway and told her that he had spoken to the mayor about renewing the school's lease on the building, which was owned by the town, and that he had let it be suggested that he would be prepared to cover any increase in the lease fee if she was sensible about certain things. Winifred stood up from her desk. She was 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and Harris Colt was nearly 6 feet, and she stood up anyway. Mr. Colt, she said, with the careful control that preceded her genuine anger, what you are describing is a condition placed on the continuance of my employment in exchange for personal favors, which is a form of coercion, and I intend to describe it in exactly those terms at the next board meeting. Harris Colt's face darkened. You are in no position. I am in the exact position I have described, she said. I suggest you leave before you say anything further that I am also obligated to report. He left, but he left the way men like him always left, with a look that said the conversation was not over, only postponed, and that the terms would be worse the next time. Winifred sat back down, picked up the arithmetic exercise she had been grading, and found that her hands were shaking. Not from fear, she told herself, though there was some of that. Mostly from the corrosive, familiar rage of a woman who has spent her life being competent and careful, and is still required to fight for the right to simply do her work. She was still sitting there, hands still, breathing controlled, when she heard boots on the schoolhouse steps, and she looked up already preparing her second speech of the evening, and found it was Jasper Slater instead of Harris Colt. He stopped in the doorway. He took in her expression and the stillness of her and the arithmetic exercise held too tightly in her left hand. I saw Colt leaving, he said. He was leaving, she said. That part went correctly. Jasper came in and sat down in the nearest student's chair, which was too small for him, and he did not say anything right away, which she found was the right thing to do. She told him about it, not in the measured, careful way she would tell the board, but in the honest and furious way she would tell someone she trusted, and she realized while she was speaking that she trusted him, and that this had happened without her engineering it, and that it was already deep enough that this realization did not surprise her. He listened to the whole of it without interruption. When she had finished, he said, "Has he done this before?" The implication about the lease. "This is the first time he has been that direct about the consequences." His jaw tightened. "You will document it exactly as you described. Every word." He nodded. "Is there anything else you need tonight?" It was such a plain and direct question, not an offer of heroics, not an implication that she needed rescuing. Simply, is there anything else you need? She felt the warm cold feeling return to her chest, and this time she did not try to name it as anything other than what it was. "No," she said. "Thank you for asking." He stood up from the inadequate chair. He stood for a moment in the lamplight of the doorway, and she thought he was going to say something else, and he did not, and she thought perhaps he should, and then she decided she would say it herself, because she was not a woman who had ever been good at waiting for things to be said. "Will you walk with me on Saturday?" she asked. "Not in the direction of the store, just a walk." He looked at her with those careful dark eyes, and then he said, "Yes." And just like that, without any of the Baroque social machinery that such things usually required in Harlan's Creek, they began. The walks became the center of Winifred's Saturdays. They walked the ridge above town, where you could see the mountains stacked against the sky like the pages of a geography book, each range paler than the one before it, until the furthest peaks were the exact blue of distance. They talked about everything, and they talked about nothing, and they talked about the things in between, which were the most interesting things. He told her about Utah, about the homestead in the Red Rock country and his father, who had been a quiet man, a former schoolteacher himself actually, which made Winifred sit up straighter. About his mother, who had been formidable and pragmatic, and had eventually rebuilt something from what remained, though what she built was smaller and quieter than what had been taken. About the years after, when Jasper had worked every type of range work available, and had moved from state to territory and back again, accumulating skills and not much else. He did not tell her everything, she knew that. There was still a territory in the middle of his history that he moved around carefully, the way you move around an injury that has not fully healed. She did not press it. She had her own territories like that. She told him about Columbus, about the engagement and its humiliating dissolution, which she described with enough self-deprecating humor that he actually laughed, a real laugh, the first full one she had heard from him, and it was a sound that rearranged something in her chest permanently. She told him about the teachers' college and the women there who had been her first real intellectual companions, and the hunger she had discovered in herself for ideas and argument and the particular pleasure of being around someone who could keep up. "Can you keep up?" she asked, on one of those Saturdays. It was meant half as a joke and half as a genuine question. He was quiet for a moment, watching the mountains. "I do not know yet," he said. "I have not met many people worth the effort of trying." She looked at him. He looked at the mountains. After a moment she looked at them too, and the cold wind came down from the heights, and they stood in it together without speaking, and it was one of the best conversations she had ever had. Mabel Hendricks noticed them together within 48 hours of the first walk, because Mabel Hendricks noticed everything, and within a week the town's attention had shifted to them in the specific way small-town attention does, which is warm and invasive and impossible to avoid. Winifred bore it with the resigned composure she applied to all unavoidable phenomena. Jasper bore it with a stillness that suggested he was well practiced at not reacting to things people wanted him to react to. Harris Colt noticed too, and Harris Colt was not warm about it. He began to say things, not loudly. Harris Colt was too careful for that, but quietly in the saloon corner and the feed store doorway and after the Sunday service, he began to say things about Jasper Slater. Things about the dark past that a man who moves that much must be running from. Things, specifically, about Abilene. Winifred heard the word Abilene for the first time from young Clara Hendricks, Mabel's daughter, who repeated it the way young people repeat things they have overheard, without understanding them, but with the instinct that they are significant. Clara said that her father had heard from Harris Colt that Jasper Slater had been involved in something in Abilene 2 years ago that was not the kind of thing a decent woman should involve herself with. Winifred thanked Clara for telling her, and then she sat with it for 2 days. The thing she sat with was not fear. It was the question of whether to ask him directly or wait for him to tell her. She knew from the shape of him and the way he told stories that he would tell her. She believed that. But Harris Colt was planting seeds of doubt in Harlan's Creek, and seeds had a way of growing in the dark without anyone tending them, and if there was something real behind the word Abilene, she needed to know. She asked him on the 3rd Saturday. They were sitting on a flat rock above the town, and the sky was the pewter color that in Wyoming meant weather coming. "Harris Colt has been saying things about Abilene," she said. She kept her voice level, factual. "I have not repeated them or believed them. I am asking you." He did not flinch. He looked at the sky for a long moment, and she watched the working of his jaw, the careful construction of what he was about to say, and she waited. "In Abilene I worked for a man named Rourke," he said at last. "He ran a freight operation. I was hired as a driver and guard. After 3 months I discovered that the freight included goods that had been stolen from homesteads in the Oklahoma Territory, families that had been burned out." His voice was flat and controlled in the way a controlled burn is controlled, carefully, with awareness of what it might become if the wind changed. "I did not know when I was hired. When I found out, I went to the federal marshal in Abilene. Rourke was arrested. Several of his men were charged." A pause. The pewter sky pressed closer. "Rourke had connections," he continued. "Lawyers, money. The kind of influence that can make a witness into the story instead of the subject. The charges were reduced. He paid a fine and went free. His lawyers put my name around as someone who had made false allegations for personal gain." His eyes came to hers. "That is what is in Abilene. I am not proud of how it ended. I am not ashamed of what I did." Winifred held his gaze for a long moment. She was running it through the analytical part of her mind, the part that had made her good at mathematics, the part that was honest with itself about what the evidence actually showed. "You told the marshal," she said. "Yes. And Rourke's money made the story worse than the truth." "Yes." "That is not a dark past," she said. "That is an injustice that was done to you." Something shifted in his face. It was very small, but she caught it. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for long enough that being believed is almost too much to absorb quickly. "Harris Colt knows the version that came from Rourke's lawyers," he said. "Harris Colt is using whatever he can find because I turned him down," she said. "I am not concerned with his version." Jasper looked at her for a long, still moment. The wind came off the mountains, sharp and cold and smelling of ice. "You are a remarkable woman, Winifred Doyle," he said, and the way he said her name, both names, with the weight of someone naming something they intended to keep, did things to her composure that she was grateful the wind provided cover for. "I am merely a practical one," she said, and he smiled, the full smile this time, the one that reached the dark eyes, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing I have been trying not to name for weeks. She was in love with him. She had been in love with him for at least 3 Saturdays and probably longer, and there was nothing to do about it except continue to walk with him and talk with him and wait for the right moment, because some things had to be arrived at and not rushed. The right moment was in the middle of being taken away from her, though she did not know it yet. On the Monday of the 4th week in October, Harris Colt went to the school board. He did not go about the lease this time. He went with the story about Abilene, presented as a concern from a responsible community member about the character of a man who was spending significant public time with the town's school teacher. The board, which was composed of 3 men who relied on Harris Colt's goodwill for various practical reasons, took his concerns seriously in the particular way that people take concerns seriously when the person expressing them controls things they depend on. The board chairman, a man named August Prentice, came to Winifred that same evening with an expression of elaborate discomfort and told her that the board felt it was important, given her position as a moral example to the children, that she be mindful of her associations. Winifred listened to all of this with the perfect stillness she used when she was at maximum fury. "Are you telling me to stop associating with Mr. Slater?" asked when Prentice had finished. "We are simply suggesting, are you placing conditions on my continued employment?" A longer pause. Prentice had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We are expressing a concern, Mr. Prentice," she said. "The last person who expressed a concern about my associations in the context of my employment was Harris Colt, who expressed it in exchange for not lobbying to raise my lease fee. I documented that conversation. I intend to document this one as well." Prentice left looking very uncomfortable indeed. But the next day, Tom Delaney told Jasper that there had been pressure from Colt, who held notes on 2 of the other ranchers in the valley, and that those ranchers had told Tom they could not be seen supporting a hand that Harris Colt had taken a position against. Tom was apologetic and clearly hated himself for what he was about to say, but he said it anyway. He needed to let Jasper go before the end of the month. Jasper took this without visible expression. He thanked Tom for being straight about it. He packed his things. He came to the school that afternoon, after the students had gone, and he stood in the doorway in his buffalo coat with his hat in his hands, and he told Winifred what had happened with a directness that was characteristic of him, and that cost him something she could see it costing him, because to a man like Jasper Slater, being driven off was the thing he hated most in the world, and this was being driven off, even if Harris Colt's fingerprints were not literally on it. "I am leaving at the end of the week," he said. "I do not want to be the reason you lose your position." "You are not the reason," she said. "Harris Colt is the reason." "Winifred." "Do not," she said, and the word came out harder than she intended. She felt the specific heartbreak of watching something being taken from her by the same kind of force that had taken his family's homestead, the force of money and influence dressed up as respectability, and she felt the fury of it rising in her like water over a dam. "Do not apologize for something that was done to you." He looked at her for a long time. The classroom was very quiet. The afternoon light came in through the window he had repaired, making a clean gold rectangle on the floorboards between them. "If I had more to offer," he started. "Stop," she said. And then, because she had never been good at waiting, "I am not interested in what you do not have, Jasper. I am interested in what you are." The silence between them was enormous and charged and very still, the way air is still in the moment before lightning. He crossed the floor in 3 steps, and he took her face in both hands, and he kissed her with the careful, restrained intensity of a man who has been very careful about very many things for a very long time, and has finally decided to stop being careful about this one specific thing. When they stepped apart, they were both breathing differently. "I will find work east of here," he said. His hands were still on either side of her face. "There is a cattle operation in the Powder River country that Colonel Harker mentioned. I can send for Jasper," she said. "I will not ask you to come to uncertainty," he said, with the stubborn look of a man being noble at great personal cost. "Jasper, your position here matters. Your work with the children, Jasper Slater," she said, with the patient firmness she used on students who had arrived at a wrong answer and needed to be redirected. "I love you." The words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water. He stared at her. She watched the impact of it move through him, and she watched him process it, and she watched the moment when he stopped processing and simply felt it. "I have been in love with you since the second Saturday on the ridge," he said, and his voice was rough with it. "I did not say it because I did not think I had the right." "You have the right," she said. "I have nothing to offer you, that is certain." "You have yourself," she said. "That is certain." He pulled her close and held her, and she let herself be held, and the late October light lay on the schoolhouse floor between them. And for a little while the world outside the window, with its injustices and its politics and its cold coming weather, was simply the world outside the window, and this was the only world that mattered. But the world outside the window was not going to stay there. The plan they arrived at over the following 2 days was this. Jasper would go ahead to the Powder River operation, establish himself, and send for Winifred when he had a position confirmed. Winifred would complete the school term to the end of November, giving the board proper notice, and then join him. They did not speak the word marriage aloud, but it was understood to be the shape of what they were moving toward, the way you do not need to name a mountain to understand that the road leads there. It was a reasonable plan. It was the kind of plan that made sense for two careful people who had both been hurt by the world's unreasonableness and had learned to move deliberately. The problem was Harris Colt, who had not finished. On Wednesday of the last week in October, Winifred arrived at school to find a letter slipped under the door. It was from the county school supervisor in the town of Bentley, 30 miles south. It informed her that following a petition submitted by a concerned citizen of Harlan's Creek, the supervisor's office was reviewing her appointment, and that she should be prepared to attend a hearing in Bentley on the 1st of December to address concerns about her conduct and judgment. The concerned citizen was not named. It did not need to be. Winifred read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it in her desk drawer. She taught the full school day with absolute professional composure. She dismissed the students at 4 o'clock. She sat at her desk in the empty classroom for 10 minutes, feeling the full weight of what Harris Colt was doing, not just to her now but to the children who depended on consistent teaching, and to the principle of a woman's ability to do her work without being subject to this kind of sustained attack. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and went to find Jasper. He was at the edge of the Delaney property, finishing the last of his fence work. He read the letter. She watched his face during this and saw the careful control tighten into something harder. "He is not going to stop," Jasper said. "I know. Even after I leave, I know." He folded the letter and handed it back. "Then I am not going ahead to Powder River." She started to object. He cut her off gently but absolutely. "I am not leaving you here alone to be driven out by him one piece at a time," he said. "If we go together. If we stay together. But I am not going somewhere else and waiting while he uses his leverage from a distance." The words fell on her like something warm and undeserved and absolutely necessary. "Together," she said. "Together," he confirmed. They had to move quickly. Harris Colt's petition gave them a deadline of December 1st for the hearing, which meant that if Winifred was going to leave Harlan's Creek on her own terms rather than under the cloud of a review finding, she needed to leave before that date and before Colt could manufacture whatever evidence he intended to present. Jasper had his wages from Tom Delaney, which was enough for 2 fares on the northbound stage as far as the junction at Fort McKinney, and from there, the Powder River country was another 2 days' ride. They decided to leave on November 15th. That gave Winifred 3 weeks to set her students up with enough materials to continue on their own until a replacement was found, to write letters to each family explaining the situation honestly, and to say goodbye to the few people in Harlan's Creek who deserved a proper goodbye. One of those people was old Father Elias Cobb, the wandering preacher. Elias Cobb was not permanently attached to Harlan's Creek. He arrived twice a year, in spring and fall, to cover the territory north of the permanent minister's range. He traveled by mule and slept in whatever shelter was available and charged nothing for his services, which ran from Sunday sermons to last rites to the blessing of newborns and the very occasional wedding. He was perhaps 65 years old, with a white beard, and eyes the pale gray of winter sky, and the absolute unshakable tranquility of a man who has decided that most of what other people consider crises are actually just weather. He arrived in Harlan's Creek on November 10th, 5 days before Winifred and Jasper's planned departure. Winifred went to see him at the church, where he stayed when he was in town. She told him she was leaving. She told him why, with the same honest directness she applied to everything. He listened to all of it without judgment or commentary, which she found, as always with Elias Cobb, enormously restoring. "And this Mr. Slater," he said when she had finished, "he is a good man. He is the best man I have encountered in my adult life," she said, with the calm certainty of someone reporting observed data. Elias Cobb smiled. He had a smile that started in his eyes about 3 seconds before it reached his mouth, and when it arrived it was warm and genuine. "Then the only question," he said, "is whether you intend to take him with you loosely or properly." Winifred looked at him. He looked back with the innocence of a man who has spent 65 years learning exactly which questions to ask. "We had not," she started. "In my experience," Elias Cobb said gently, "people who intend to find each other afterward are more likely to succeed if they have already committed to it. The frontier is a large place. Plans do not always survive it." She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "I would have to ask him." "You seem to me like a woman who knows how to ask things directly," said Elias Cobb. She did know how. She found Jasper that evening at the edge of town, where he had taken to spending the evenings now that he was no longer at the Delaney Ranch, sitting on the fence rail above the creek looking at the mountains in the last of the light. "Elias Cobb is in town," she said. "I know. I saw him this morning. He asked me a question," she said, "about whether we intended to travel together loosely or properly." Jasper looked at her. The last light was behind the mountains now, and the sky above them was the deep blue that comes before dark, clear and cold and infinite. "What did you tell him?" he asked. "I told him I needed to ask you first." He looked at the mountains for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Winifred Doyle," he said, and she heard the same full name weight she had heard from him before. "Will you marry me?" There was nothing elaborate about it. There was no ring. There was no prepared speech. There was just a man on a fence rail in the last light of a November evening in Wyoming, asking the only question that mattered. "Yes," she said. He got down from the fence rail and held her again, and this time there was something different in it, something settled and sure, the weight of a thing that has been decided and does not need to be decided again. They went to Elias Cobb together. He agreed to marry them with the warm satisfaction of a man whose instincts have just been confirmed. The ceremony, he said, could be done properly on the morning before they left, November 15th. He would have it recorded with the county clerk in Bentley, where he was heading next anyway, which would make it entirely legal. This was the plan. The plan made excellent sense. It was simple and clean and achievable. Then November 14th brought the snow. It came in the afternoon, first as a gray sky, then as a few flakes that could have been dust, then as the particular focused intensity of a storm that had made up its mind. By 4 in the afternoon, the street was white and the mountains had disappeared. By 6, it was the kind of snow that comes sideways and turns familiar landmarks into guesses. By 8, It was the kind of storm that Winifred, in her 14 months in Wyoming, had never seen, and that old Harve Delacroix at the general store said had not come this early or this hard since 1871. Jasper came to Winifred's boarding house at 7 to tell her that the stage out of Harlan's Creek had already suspended service until the road was clear. The northbound stage would not come. The road to Fort McKinney was impassable. "Then we wait," she said. "Harris Colt's hearing is December 1st. Then we wait and we figure out the hearing." He was at the window looking at the white nothing outside it. The lamp threw warm light across the room. The storm threw itself against the glass. "The way station at Miller's Crossing is 6 miles north," he said. "A man there has good horses. If we leave early in the morning, we can get ahead of the worst of it and get to the junction. In this, it is worse tonight than it will be tomorrow morning. These storms run hard and then they pause." He turned from the window. "If we wait, the hearing becomes a weapon he can use. If we go now, where is Elias Cobb?" she asked. Jasper was quiet for a moment. "He was heading north today before the storm came in. He may be at the way station." Winifred sat with this. Outside, the storm pressed against the house with the intimacy of something that wants to get inside. She looked at the packed carpetbag by the door, the box of her mother's books, the small pile of her life in Harlan's Creek, reduced to what could be carried. "If Elias Cobb is at the way station," she said slowly, "then we could—" "Yes," he said. "You would be willing to in a snowstorm, Winifred," he said, with a simplicity that reduced the whole question to its essential. "There is nowhere I would rather be." She stood up and picked up her carpetbag. They left at 4 in the morning, when the storm paused between its worst 2 gusts, the way Jasper had predicted it would. He had 2 horses from old Harve, who had been bribed with 2 months of Winifred's future earnings and Jasper's last good knife. They wore every layer they owned. The snow was deep, but the horses were strong and Jasper knew how to read the land in white even in the dark, following the fence lines and the shallow creek beds that were still discernible under the snow if you knew what you were looking for. They did not talk. The storm absorbed all language. They rode close together, and the cold was a living thing that pressed itself against every exposed inch of skin. And Winifred focused on the square of Jasper's back in front of her, on staying in the saddle, on the knowledge that 6 miles in these conditions was 3 times harder than 6 miles in good weather, but was still 6 miles. They reached Miller's Crossing way station in just under 2 hours. The light from the way station window was the most beautiful thing Winifred had seen in a long time. It was a low building, solid, built from river stone and heavy timber, and the light inside it was warm and gold and real. Jasper helped her down from the horse. She could not feel her feet and her hands were wooden inside their gloves. He got the horses into the small attached stable, then came back and helped her through the door, and the heat of the fire inside the way station was a physical force, like a hand against the chest. And there, standing at the table in the way station with his coat still on and his Bible open in front of him and a cup of coffee steaming at his elbow, was Elias Cobb. He looked up at them when they came in. He looked at Jasper. He looked at Winifred. He looked at the carpetbag and the box of books. He took in, with the practiced eye of a man who had been reading human situations for 65 years, the entirety of what had brought them here in a storm at 6 in the morning. He picked up his cup of coffee. "I had a feeling," he said, "that I should not move on yet." That was the moment Winifred had stood against the wall and screamed Jasper's name. Because after that moment of recognition, after the warmth of the fire had begun to restore feeling to her hands and feet, after the initial speechless relief of arrival, Jasper had turned to her with his coat still on and his dark eyes full of something complicated, and he had said the thing he had been holding back. He said, "There is something else in Abilene, something I did not tell you." The whole room seemed to pause. Even the storm seemed to pause, or perhaps she only imagined it. "Tell me," she said. There was a woman in Abilene before work, before any of the rest of it. We had an understanding. Her name was Clara Marsh." He was looking at the floor, then made himself look at her face. "She was killed. In a fire. The fire was in a boarding house where several of Rourke's men had been. I was never able to prove a connection, but I believed it and I still believe it. His voice was controlled, but barely. Reason I went to the marshal about Rourke was not entirely about justice for the homesteaders. It was about her. The fire crackled. The storm spoke outside. I need you to know that, he said. I need you to know that the man you are considering spending your life with has this in him. This debt that has not been paid, this grief that is not finished. I did not want to say the vows and have this thing behind them unexplained. Winifred looked at him for a long time. She thought about the weight he had carried. She thought about the way he moved around the center of his history on their walks. She thought about what it meant to carry a debt like that and what it meant that he wanted to be honest about it before the words were said. You went to the marshal, she said. Yes. You tried to get justice for her. I tried, I failed. You did not fail, she said. The system failed, you tried. She crossed the room to him. She put her hands against his face the way he had put his hands against hers in the schoolhouse. Jasper Slater, I am not asking you to have no past. I am asking you to have it with me. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were very bright. Marry us, Elias, she said, without looking away from Jasper. And that was when Elias Cobb straightened from where he had been leaning tactfully against the far wall, smoothed the page of his Bible, and said, with the tranquil authority of a man who has been waiting for this cue, I was hoping you would get to that. The ceremony was short, and the ceremony was real. Elias Cobb had a way of conducting it that stripped out all the performance and left only the substance, which was simply two people choosing each other in front of a witness, and in the sight of whatever they believed was larger than themselves. The storm was the church, and the fire was the altar, and the words were old and simple and absolutely necessary. Do you, Jasper Slater, take this woman, Winifred Doyle, to be your lawful wedded wife? I do. Do you, Winifred Doyle, take this man, Jasper Slater, to be your lawful wedded husband? I do, she said, and the words came out with the full weight of everything she was and everything she had decided, and she felt them land in her body like something long absent coming home. Then by the authority vested in me by the Lord and the territory of Wyoming, said Elias Cobb, I pronounce you married. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may you keep each other with equal care. The storm howled outside. Jasper kissed her, and the kiss was different from the first one in the schoolhouse, different from all the almost moments between that first one and this, because this one was not the beginning of something uncertain. This one was the beginning of something decided. Elias Cobb poured 3 cups of coffee, and they sat at the waystation table as the storm ran its full length around them. And they talked until morning, the way people talk when they have just done something irreversible and wonderful, and are not yet ready to sleep because they are too awake to the reality of it. They talked about Utah and Ohio and Abilene and Columbus, and the mountains and the plains, and the particular kind of life that was possible in the West for people who were willing to build it with their hands. Elias Cobb told them about a valley in the Powder River country, which he had passed through twice in his wanderings, where he had noticed good water and good grass and land that was not yet claimed. He described it with the specificity of a man who pays attention to the details of the world he passes through, and as he described it, Winifred and Jasper looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that was the mutual recognition of a shared image, a shared possible future, taking shape. The storm broke by mid-morning of the next day. When it broke cleanly, the way Wyoming storms did, leaving behind a world that was entirely white and entirely still and lit by a sun that came back with full force, making the snow on every surface brilliant and sharp. Jasper went out to check the horses. Winifred stood in the waystation doorway and looked at the world made new under the white, and she felt the peculiar and complete joy of a woman who has arrived at something true. They left the waystation at noon on November 15th, 1879. The road north was difficult but passable. Elias Cobb rode with them for the first 4 miles before his path turned west, toward Bentley and the county clerk's office, where he would file their marriage record before the day was out. He turned on the road, and they turned on the road, and they looked at each other across the distance. "Safe travels, preacher," Jasper called. "Already have been," Elias Cobb called back, and he raised his hand once, and then he and his mule went west, small against the white landscape and the enormous sky, and Winifred watched him go with a warmth in her chest that she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life. The Powder River country received them in the late afternoon of the second day, as the light was failing and the temperature was dropping, and the horses were tired and ready to be done. They came down out of the hills, and the valley Elias Cobb had described opened before them, and even in the failing light it was recognizable. Good water, a creek running clear over a stone bed, and good grass under the snow, visible in the brown seed heads that stood above the white, and timber on the north slope for building, and the kind of wide open silence that was not the silence of emptiness but of possibility. They stopped on the rise above it. "There," Winifred said. "There," Jasper agreed. They rode down into the valley together. The first winter was hard in the way all first winters were hard for people starting from almost nothing, but it was hard in the way of a challenge rather than a defeat, which was an important distinction. They found a deserted homesteader's cabin on the north side of the valley that was structurally sound and needed work, and they did the work. Jasper rebuilt the roof, and repointed the chimney and cut timber for a woodpile that he built 3 times as high as seemed strictly necessary, because he had grown up in a place where winters had teeth, and he respected the teeth. Winifred unpacked her mother's books and put them on a shelf that Jasper built from timber he cut from the north slope, and she organized the inside of the cabin with the systematic efficiency of a woman who has lived alone and knows exactly how every inch of a small space should be used. They had $63 between them when they arrived, and they stretched it through the winter with the careful discipline of people who had both, at different points in their lives, understood what it felt like to have nothing. They ate from what could be hunted, and from a small root cellar they found attached to the cabin, which had been left with dried beans and 2 sacks of grain, and a barrel of apples that were soft but still good. They supplemented by trading labor with 2 neighboring homesteading families, the Breckenridge family to the east, and a man named Solomon Webb who ran sheep on the western side of the valley. Solomon Webb was an interesting man. He was 43, a former schoolteacher himself, who had come west from Pennsylvania for his health, and had found that the open air had restored him, and that he had no desire to return. He was quiet and bookish, and had an impressive library for a man living in a sheep camp, and he and Winifred became friends with the quick recognition of 2 people who read the same kinds of things, and he and Jasper became friends with the slower recognition of 2 men who respected each other's competence. Through that winter, Jasper and Winifred built the kind of marriage that is built between 2 people who know what they want from each other and have decided to stop waiting to have it. It was not without difficulty. They were both people with strong opinions and the willingness to defend them, and there were arguments, real ones, not the decorative kind but the kind that come from 2 genuine people trying to figure out how to fit together. The arguments about small things were easy to get through. The harder arguments were about the larger ones. The hardest was about Harris Colt's hearing. In December, a letter arrived from August Prentice, forwarded through Solomon Webb, who had a post address at the nearest settlement. It informed Winifred that the hearing had been conducted in her absence and that the county supervisor had determined, given that she had vacated her position without proper notice, that she would not be permitted to teach in the county of Harlan's Creek in the future. Winifred read the letter twice and was very still for a long time. Jasper watched her. "He won the hearing," she said. "In Harlan's Creek County," he said. "I violated the conditions of my contract by leaving without proper notice. In a blizzard that shut the stage road. The board does not know that. We could write and explain." She was quiet. He waited because he had learned to wait for the full process of her thinking. "The children need a teacher," she said, finally. "That is the actual problem, not my certificate, not Harris Colt, the children. If the board is punishing me for leaving, they are not finding a replacement and the children are sitting in that schoolhouse without consistent instruction. Jasper looked at her. What do you want to do? I want to write to the Territorial Education Office in Cheyenne, she said. Not about myself. About the children. About the fact that the board's political response to a personal dispute has left 12 children without a teacher in the middle of the school year. I want the territorial office to send an inspector. He said nothing for a moment. Then, that will make enemies of the board and of Colt permanently. They are already my enemies, she said, with the calm of someone who has finished being afraid of a thing. I would rather make them useful ones. He looked at her with the expression she had first seen in the schoolhouse doorway on that Tuesday evening, the one that said she was remarkable, and then he nodded once and got up to find paper and pen. The letter went to Cheyenne in January. The response came in March, which was faster than expected and suggested that the Territorial Education Office had its own concerns about Harris Colt's influence in the region, concerns that had probably been building for some time and that Winifred's letter had provided the documented occasion to address. An inspector was sent. The board was reviewed. The inspector's report, which Winifred eventually obtained a copy of through Solomon Webb's connections, found significant irregularities in the board's management and recommended corrective measures, which included the proper appointment of a new teacher with full territorial oversight of the process. Harris Colt did not emerge from the process untouched. The inspector, it turned out, had also received communications from two of the smaller ranchers in the valley, emboldened by the territorial inquiry, about Colt's practice of using his note holding to pressure their business decisions. Nothing came to court, because courts in Wyoming Territory in 1879 moved slowly and in the direction of the best-funded party, but Harris Colt's reputation in the valley shifted in the way reputations shift when they are publicly questioned, which is to say, quietly, permanently, and in ways that mattered to how people dealt with him going forward. Tom Delaney wrote to Jasper in February. He wrote to say that he had heard about the inspection and that he was sorry for the way things had gone, and that if Jasper ever needed a reference in the Powder River country, he would be glad to provide one without conditions. Jasper wrote back. He thanked Tom for the offer and said that things were going well and that he did not require a reference just at present, but that he valued the offer. He showed the letter to Winifred. She read it and said, "He is a decent man who was in an impossible position." "Yes," Jasper agreed. "Forgive him, already have." Spring came to the valley with the particular extravagance of Wyoming springs, which made up for the violence of the winters by being absolutely and completely alive. The snow went off the hills in a matter of days, and the grass came back so fast you could almost see it moving, and the creek ran high and loud with melt water, and the air was full of the sound of birds that had been somewhere warmer and were now returning. With the spring, Jasper built the beginning of something larger. He had spent the winter planning it, in the methodical way he planned things, sketching it on paper by lamplight while Winifred read, refining it based on her questions and observations, and the knowledge she brought from the geography books that included material on soil composition and water management. He was going to run cattle. Not the enormous scale of a Harris Colt operation, nothing like that, but a proper working ranch on a scale that could sustain a family and could be managed without the kind of debt that made a man vulnerable. He began by building the fence, 3 miles of it, along the natural boundaries of the best grazing land in the valley. He built it the way he built everything, carefully and correctly the first time, because he had been repairing other people's badly built fences for years, and he knew what proper construction looked like from the outside. He bought 12 head of cattle in April with money borrowed from Solomon Webb at honest interest, and 6 more in June when the first grass cutting was good enough to sell a portion for feed. And by the end of the summer, he had 30 head and a fence line and a water management arrangement with the Breckenridge family that worked in both their interests. Winifred taught, not formally. The formal position was gone with Harris Colt's hearing, and she did not yet have the energy to pursue a new appointment in a new county, though she would, eventually. In the meantime, she taught the Breckenridge children informally, 4 of them ranging in age from 7 to 14, coming to their house 3 mornings a week, and bringing her mother's books and the careful, serious attention she gave to every student. She taught Solomon Webb's 2 nephews who had come out from Pennsylvania to help with the sheep and who were, it emerged, both nearly illiterate and deeply ashamed of it, and deeply grateful to be taught without being made to feel ashamed of it. She organized an informal school in the valley that by autumn of 1880 had 9 regular students, which was unofficial and unsanctioned, but was also, by any measurable standard, working. It was in the autumn of 1880 that she discovered she was expecting a child. She had suspected it for several weeks and had turned the suspicion over in her mind with the same careful analytical process she applied to everything. And when she was certain, she told Jasper on a Sunday morning when they were sitting at the table before the fire with their coffee, and the light was coming in through the window clean and gold in the way of autumn mornings. She just said it plainly. She said, "I am going to have a baby." He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her. The expression that crossed his face was not a single thing. It was large and complex and moved through him like the storm had moved through the valley, changing everything it touched. It was joy and terror and wonder and the specific weight of a man who has not let himself want certain things for a long time and is now confronted with the evidence that they are going to happen. He came around the table and he sat beside her and he took her hand in both of his and he said, with a roughness in his voice that he did not try to hide, "Tell me everything you know about it. Tell me what you need." She laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was him, so perfectly him, to make his first response a question about what she required. "I need you to be the father of my children," she said. "I believe I have already arranged that." He kissed her forehead. He held her hand. They sat together in the autumn morning and let the reality of it settle around them like the warmest kind of weather. Their son was born in May of 1881. They named him Samuel after Jasper's father. He arrived with Jasper present and a woman named Ruth Breckenridge, who had assisted at several frontier births, serving as midwife. He was healthy and loud and had Jasper's dark eyes and Winifred's emphatic expression, and he was the most specific and particular person either of them had ever seen. Jasper held him first, at Winifred's insistence, and the sight of this careful, contained, deeply competent man holding a newborn baby with an expression of absolute undisguised wonder was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She told him so directly, in the plain way she said everything. "You are extraordinary," she said. He looked up from the baby. "You did all the work." "We did all the work," she said. "That is the general arrangement." He smiled, and the smile reached his eyes, and Samuel blinked in the direction of the smile as if noticing it. The ranch grew. The informal school grew. Solomon Webb formally partnered with Jasper in the spring of 1882, contributing capital for a larger cattle purchase in exchange for a share in the operation, and the right to continue running his sheep on the western pasture, which worked better than anyone had expected, partly because Jasper had excellent instincts for range management, and partly because Solomon Webb was meticulous about his own fencing, which kept the species from interfering with each other in the ways that were supposed to be inevitable. Elias Cobb came through the valley in the spring of 1882. He arrived on his mule on a Tuesday afternoon, and they saw him coming down the valley road, small against the landscape and absolutely recognizable by the upright posture of a man who carries his years lightly. Winifred was hanging washing, and she stopped and stood very still for a moment, and then she went to the yard gate and waited. He rode up to the gate. He looked at her. He looked at the cabin, larger now with the addition Jasper had put on it through the winter. He looked at the fence lines, visible in the distance, and the cattle moving behind them. He looked at the boy sitting in the dirt near the porch with a carved wooden horse, which Jasper had made on winter evenings from the same kind of careful, quiet attention he brought to everything. "Samuel," Elia's cob said. "Samuel," she confirmed. He got down from his mule. He came through the gate. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment, just briefly, in the way he had touched Samuel's shoulder that day behind the barn, the way that meant, "I see you and I am glad." "Show me everything," he said. She showed him everything. The school that afternoon had 4 children in it when she took him through, because she was teaching them geography that day. And she introduced him, and he sat in the corner and watched with the absorbed interest of a man who had himself been a great deal of places and found the teaching of geography to be a serious and undervalued art. He said afterward that she was one of the best teachers he had encountered in 20 years of crossing this territory, and she knew he was not saying it to be kind, because Elia's cob was not a man who said things to be kind. Jasper came in from the range in the late afternoon, still dusty and smelling of horses, and when he saw Elia's cob at the table with his coffee and Samuel on the old preacher's knee, something crossed his face that was almost exactly what had crossed it when she told him about the baby, that same compound of joy and wonder, and the specific expression of a man for whom these things are still not entirely expected. He shook Elia's cob's hand. They sat at the table together and talked for 3 hours, the way they had talked in the waystation in the storm, except that now the storm was outside the history and they were inside the warmth they had built, and the conversation ranged from theology to cattle prices to the question of Wyoming statehood, which was a topic all 3 of them had opinions about. Elia's cob stayed 2 nights. On the morning of his 3rd day, he conducted a brief Sunday service in the yard for the valley families who came, 8 adults and 11 children, standing in the spring sunshine with his Bible and his unshakable certainty that the Lord conducted his most important business in the most unexpected places. When he left, he turned at the gate and looked at both of them. "That waystation in the storm," he said. "I have thought about it many times." "So have we," Winifred said. "I never perform a ceremony I do not believe in," he said. "I want you to know that, in case it was ever in question." "It was not in question," Jasper said. Elia's cob nodded. He climbed on his mule. He raised his hand. And then he went on, as wanderers do, to wherever the road needed him next. The years that followed the spring of 1882 were the years of the building, which was both the literal building of the ranch into something that could sustain, and the deeper building of a life that was genuinely theirs, shaped by their own choices and their own work rather than by the expectations of other people's towns and other people's social arrangements. In the summer of 1883, Winifred finally applied for formal teaching credentials in Johnson County, the county in which they were now properly settled. The application required several letters of recommendation and a formal examination, which she found insufficiently challenging, and a hearing before the county school board, which she found more interesting. The board asked her about her departure from Harlan's Creek without proper notice. She explained about the blizzard and about the stage road, and about Harris Colt's actions with complete and documented precision, and she presented a copy of the territorial inspector's report, which she had finally obtained through a connection Solomon Webb had in Cheyenne. The board approved her credentials. She began teaching formally in the autumn of 1883 at the newly established school in the settlement of Mill Creek, which was 3 miles from the ranch. She rode there on a good horse that Jasper had selected for her, with the same careful attention he gave to all equipment that mattered, a steady roan mare named Particular, which Winifred found an excellent name. The Mill Creek School had 14 students in its first year and 17 in its second. By 1885, it had 22, and was requesting an additional teacher from the county, which the county approved after Winifred wrote a letter so precisely arguing the case for the resource that the board approved it simply to avoid the prospect of receiving another letter of similar precision. Danny Flores wrote to her in the autumn of 1884. He was 17 now and had been apprenticed to a surveyor in Cheyenne, and was doing well and was, he said, still carrying the carved horse in his pocket, though he was aware this was perhaps a childish thing. She wrote back and told him that what the horse represented was not childish at all, and that she hoped he would continue to carry it as long as it meant something to him. She told Jasper about the letter. He read it and sat quietly for a moment and then said, "Good," in the particular way that encompassed many things. She applied for official recognition of the Valley School in the spring of 1885. This involved a longer bureaucratic process that she conducted with the patient, methodical determination she applied to all important projects. The formal recognition came in September of 1885, and the school was given an official name, the Slater Valley School, which the county assigned in the conventional practice of naming schools after the area's primary landowner, and which Winifred accepted with mixed feelings about the principle of the thing and complete satisfaction about this specific instance of it. Their daughter was born in February of 1885. They named her Rose, which was Jasper's suggestion, and Winifred had agreed with the immediate certainty she sometimes felt about things that were right. Rose arrived in a manner that suggested she intended to make an impression, which she did, and continued to do as she grew, because Rose had both Jasper's physical determination and Winifred's vocal precision, and the combination was, at certain moments, spectacular. Samuel was almost 4 when Rose arrived, and he approached his sister with the earnest caution of a child who has been thoroughly prepared by 2 thoughtful people and is applying the preparation carefully. He decided, after approximately 2 weeks, that she was satisfactory, and from that point on appointed himself her general protector with a seriousness that everyone found affecting. In 1886, the ranch had grown to the point where Jasper needed to hire 2 full-time hands. He hired them carefully, as he did everything, with the specific attention of a man who knew what bad hiring looked like from the inside. One of them was a young man named Patrick Nolan from County Cork, recently arrived in America and possessed of what Jasper described as excellent instincts and no bad habits yet, and the other was a Crow man named Climbing Bear, who came recommended by a rancher to the north, and who knew the valley's terrain and seasonal patterns better than anyone else available. Jasper paid both men fairly, which in that time and in that place was not guaranteed and was, in the case of Climbing Bear, actively unusual. Winifred had been very direct with him, at the start of their plans to hire, about what fair wages for all workers meant to her, and he had been entirely in agreement because it was also, he said, simply good business to pay people what they were worth, and good business and the right thing were more often the same thing than people admitted. Climbing Bear became, over the following years, one of the people they trusted most, the quiet, observant kind of trust that is built from consistent evidence over time. He taught Samuel and Rose about the land in ways that supplemented what Winifred could offer from books, the names of plants, and what they indicated about the season, the reading of weather from the behavior of animals, the particular relationship between the creek sound and the snowpack in the mountains. Winifred was grateful for this in the deep way she was grateful for anything that expanded what her children could understand about the world they actually lived in. In the spring of 1887, Jasper made a trip to Abilene. He went alone. He told Winifred he was going, and he told her why, fully and completely. He wanted to find Clara Marsh's family. He wanted to tell them in person what had happened and what he had tried to do, and he wanted to apologize for the failure, even though the failure had not been his. Winifred had listened to this with the still attention she gave to things that mattered. When he finished, she said, "Do you want me to come with you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think this is something I need to do by myself," he said. "Then go," she said, "and come back." He was gone 3 weeks. When he came back, he was quieter than usual for a few days, moving through the ranch work with a focused attention that was doing double duty. She did not ask. She waited. On the fifth evening he came to where she was sitting with her mending, and he sat down beside her, and he told her what he had found. Clara's mother was alive, an older woman living in a small house on the edge of Abilene who had received him with a stillness that had reminded him of Winifred, actually, the specific stillness of a person who is accustomed to absorbing difficult things without falling apart. He had told her everything. She had listened to all of it. At the end, she had thanked him for coming. She had told him that she had never believed the story Rourke's lawyers had spread, because she had known who her daughter trusted, and her daughter had trusted Jasper Slater. She had told him that the debt he felt was not a debt he owed her. She had told him to go home to his family. When he finished telling Winifred this, he was quiet for a long time. "Are you free of it?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "More than I was," he said. "Enough." She put down her mending and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat by the fire in the evening with the sound of their children sleeping in the back room and the sound of the valley outside the window. And the thing that had been carried for years was not gone, because it would never be entirely gone, but it was placed now, properly and finally, in the part of the past where it belonged. The summer of 1888 brought good grass and good cattle prices, and a range of smaller good things that accumulated into the specific satisfaction of work that has been done well over time. Samuel was 7 and serious, and showed strong early signs of his grandfather's love of books and his father's precision. Rose was 3 and emphatic, and showed strong early signs of her mother's directness and her father's determination. Patrick Nolan had learned enough about ranching to have plans of his own, which Jasper and Winifred encouraged, and he had also fallen in love with Mary Breckenridge, which everyone else in the valley had seen coming for 2 years before Patrick had noticed it himself. Solomon Webb's health, which had never been entirely robust, began to decline in the winter of 1888. He spent the winter at the ranch, at Jasper and Winifred's insistence, because the sheep camp in winter was not suitable for someone with a lung weakness. He spent the winter reading and talking and watching Samuel, and Rose with the absorbed interest of a man who has no children of his own, and finds other people's children immensely interesting when they are interesting children, which these were. He died in March of 1889, quietly in the room they had given him, on a morning when the snow was melting off the mountains for the last time that winter. He had been a good partner and a good friend, and he had, in the way of good people, made everything around him slightly better by being in it. He left his share of the ranch operation to Jasper and his books to Winifred. The books filled a second shelf and spilled onto a third, and Winifred organized them with the same system she used for her school books, and the ranch house had now, by any reasonable assessment, a library of which a small Eastern college would not be ashamed. Wyoming became a state in July of 1890, which was the occasion for a celebration in the valley that Solomon Webb would have enjoyed enormously. They held it at the ranch because the ranch was now the largest gathering space in the valley, with the barn cleared and the yard set with tables, and 14 families came, and there was music from a fiddle that Patrick Nolan had been teaching himself for 2 years and had just begun to be genuinely good at, and there was food enough for twice the number. Elia's Cobb came, which was a surprise that was not quite a surprise, because Elia's Cobb had a way of appearing at significant moments that had long since passed the stage of coincidence and entered the territory of his particular kind of grace. He arrived at sunset, dusty from the road, and dismounted his mule in the yard where children were running and music was playing, and the whole valley seemed to have gathered in the warm July evening, and he stood for a moment taking it all in with his pale gray eyes and his particular tranquility. Winifred saw him from across the yard. She made her way through the gathering to him, and he took both her hands and looked at her with the expression she had first seen by firelight in the waystation in the storm. "You built something real," he said. "We built something real," she said. "We had help." He looked across the yard to where Jasper was standing with Samuel on his shoulders, Samuel reaching up to touch the low branch of the cottonwood that overhung the yard, and both of them laughing at something. "From the beginning," Elias Cobb said, "I believed in this one." "From the beginning," Winifred agreed. "So did I." He stayed 2 days. He conducted a service on the Sunday for the new state and the old valley and everyone in between, and it was one of the finest services she had ever heard, which she told him, and he said it was the location that was doing the work. He said goodbye at the gate the same way he always did, with his hand raised and the mule turning west, and this time Samuel was standing beside Winifred, and he raised his hand back, very seriously, the way children mirror things they find important, and Elias Cobb saw it, and the smile that started in his eyes arrived at his mouth in the way of all things worth waiting for. Then he was gone down the road, small against the enormous sky, carrying whatever he needed and nothing extra, the way wanderers do. It was in the winter of 1891, when the snow was on the mountains and the valley was deep in the particular silence of cold that is its own kind of peace, that Jasper told her the last thing he had never told anyone. They were sitting by the fire, Samuel asleep, Rose asleep, the house warm around them with the specific warmth of a well-built thing made to do exactly what it is doing. He had been quiet all evening in the particular way that meant something was turning over in him and coming toward the surface. He said, "When I left Utah after the homestead, I was angry for a long time." She waited. "Not the contained kind," he said, "the kind that could have gone wrong. I made choices in those years that were close to the edge of who I wanted to be, not quite over it, but close." She looked at the fire. "I want you to know that," he said. "I want you to know the whole geography of it. You asked me in the waystation to have the past with you. I am making sure you have all of it." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, with the expression she had learned over 11 years to read very well, the expression of a man being completely honest about something that costs him. "Jasper," she said. He looked at her. "I have had the whole of it with you, every year, every decision. Everything you have done since the moment I first saw you. I know who you are, and I know who you chose to be." She put her hand over his. "Whatever was close to the edge in those years, you chose correctly. You chose yourself. That is who I married." He looked at her hand over his for a long moment. "I am so grateful," he said, "that Elias Cobb had not left that waystation." "So am I," she said. "I am grateful it was a storm," he said, and something almost like humor moved in his eyes, that characteristic movement that had been rare at first and was now one of the most familiar things in her world. "I would have found another reason to leave if the road had been clear." "I know," she said. "I would have caught you anyway." He pulled her close. She let herself be pulled, not because she needed to be held, but because she wanted to be, which was its own kind of freedom. Outside the window the valley was dark and white and perfectly still, the mountains invisible behind the winter dark, the creek frozen quiet under its ice, and all around them the ranch lay settled and real, fence lines and cattle, and a barn full of good horses and 12 years of work that had made this particular piece of the world theirs. Their third child arrived in September of 1892. They named him Thomas, which was nobody's name in particular, just a name they both liked and which fit him from the first day, which Winifred said was always a good sign. Thomas was a calm baby in the way Samuel had been earnest and Rose had been emphatic, and he spent his early months regarding the world with a considering expression that Jasper said looked like he was evaluating evidence before drawing conclusions, which Winifred found enormously satisfying. Samuel was 11 when Thomas was born, old enough to be genuinely useful in the way children become useful when they are given real responsibilities, and he appointed himself Thomas's assistant protector with the same seriousness he had applied to Rose, which Rose found both touching and slightly redundant, given that she had long ago decided she was perfectly capable of protecting herself and anyone else within range. The valley had grown by 1892 into something that was recognizably a community. There were 23 families now, 2 businesses at the settlement of Mill Creek, a proper road maintained by community effort, the school with 28 students, and the beginning of a civic life with the particular flavor of a place that has built itself from the bottom up rather than having structure imposed from above. There were the usual conflicts and cooperations and the rotating cast of difficulties that any human community produces, and there was the particular texture of a place where people were genuinely trying to live well and mostly succeeding. Winifred was on the first board of the Mill Creek School as an official trustee. She was the first woman on the board. This had required approximately 4 months of argument, all of which she won on the merits, and the board was now operating more effectively than it had before she joined it, which she noted without editorial comment because the evidence spoke clearly enough on its own. Patrick Nolan and Mary Breckenridge had 2 children and a small but solid ranch of their own on the eastern side of the valley, which Jasper had helped them establish with the same patient, specific generosity he showed toward everything worth helping. Climbing Bear had gone north to his family's territory in 1890, the year of Wyoming statehood, with the particular awareness of a man watching a political moment that would have consequences for his people. And he had gone with Jasper's full understanding and a letter from Jasper to the federal land office in Cheyenne that was as strongly worded and precisely documented as anything Winifred had ever produced, which was saying something. The letter had not changed federal policy. One letter could not change federal policy. But Jasper had written it because it was right to write it, and because he had told Winifred when they were still in Harlan's Creek that justice had to be claimed and reclaimed and documented every time, and he had meant it. In the spring of 1894, Elias Cobb came one last time. He was older. The years showed on him in the way they show on people who have spent them outdoors, as whether in the face and economy and the movement, though the eyes were the same pale gray certainty they had always been. He came from the north, which was different from his usual direction, and he rode a different mule, which he explained by saying the first mule had died at the age of 23 and had deserved a proper obituary which he had provided. He stayed a week this time. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the valley and talked with Jasper and Winifred, and played a kind of geography game with Samuel that turned into a genuine contest, because Samuel at 13 had read every book in the house twice and had strong opinions about South American river systems. He told Rose stories from his travels that she absorbed with the concentrated attention of a child who is already planning to go and see for herself. He held Thomas and said he was a thoughtful-looking boy, and Winifred said that was exactly the right word. On the last evening, after the children were in bed, the 3 of them sat on the porch in the late spring dark. The valley was full of the sound of frogs from the creek and the smell of new grass, and the stars were as bright as they always were in Wyoming, which was to say, aggressively, completely bright. "I will not be back this way," he said, not sadly, simply. Winifred felt the truth of it settle into her. "You have covered a great deal of ground," she said. "A great deal," he agreed. "And this," he gestured at the valley, the ranch, the house, at the whole accumulated thing, "is the best piece of it." "You said in the waystation that you had a feeling you should not move on yet," Jasper said. "I did." "Were you actually surprised to find us there?" Elias Cobb was quiet for a moment. The frogs sang from the creek. The stars were very bright. "I have learned," he said, "to expect the Lord to conduct important business in bad weather, so perhaps surprised is not quite the word." Jasper looked at him with the expression he had for the people he trusted completely, which was open in a way that was very rare in his face and very certain when it appeared. "Thank you," he said, "for being there." "Thank you," Elias Cobb said, "for giving me something worth witnessing." He left the next morning before they were up, which was his way, appearing and disappearing like weather, like the wanderer he had always been. He left his old Bible on the table with a note inside the cover. The note said, "This belongs here where it can be read. I have another." Winifred put the Bible on the shelf with the others. It sat between two of Solomon Webb's books, and she thought that was right, that Elias Cobb and Solomon Webb should be side by side on a shelf in Wyoming, these two particular people who had been given to them by the road and the storm and the kind of luck that is indistinguishable from grace. Jasper found her standing at the shelf. He came to stand beside her. He was looking at the Bible, and then at the shelf, and then at the room around them, at the evidence of everything they had built together. "Do you remember," she said, "that you told me you had nothing certain to offer? I remember." "You were wrong," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the shelf, at the books, at the whole ordinary, extraordinary life that occupied this room. "You offered yourself," she said. "That was the certain thing. That was the only thing that mattered." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And outside, the valley moved into the full morning of a late spring day in Wyoming, the grass new and the mountains clear, and the children beginning to wake in the back rooms with the sounds of children beginning their days. And the ranch lay all around them in the morning light, solid and real and theirs. Built from nothing but the choice they had made in a snowstorm at 4 in the morning, with a wandering preacher and an open Bible, and the absolute conviction that this was the right direction, and they were going there together. They never looked back, not because the past was without pain or loss or the things that need to be carried. Not because Abilene stopped mattering or because the homestead in Utah was not a wound that had shaped the man she loved. Not because Harris Colt had not been real, or the injustice of the hearing, or the cold of the storm. All of it was real. All of it had been carried and named and placed where it belonged. They never looked back because everything worth having was here, in this valley, in this ranch, in the 3 sleeping children and the shelf of books, and the fence lines running straight across good grass toward mountains that were always there, always exactly where they were supposed to be. Because some choices, made correctly, do not need to be revised. They only need to be lived. And they lived it, every day of it, in the full knowledge of what it had cost and what it was worth, which turned out to be the same thing. Samuel Slater grew into a man who surveyed land for the state of Wyoming, and who carried a carved horse in his coat pocket until he was 32 years old, which was when his own son was born, and he placed it in the boy's hands. Rose Slater grew into a woman who went first to Cheyenne, and then further, who became one of the first women admitted to the Wyoming bar in 1911, and who argued her cases with the precision and the absolute lack of flinching that her mother had taught her by example every day of her childhood. Thomas Slater became a teacher, which surprised no one who had seen him at 13 calmly evaluating everything around him, and which would have made Jasper's father very glad. Jasper Slater ran his valley ranch until he was 67 years old, when his knees made the riding painful enough that he handed the primary work to Thomas and spent his days doing the smaller things and the advisory things, which he did with the same exact care he had given to every task in his life. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the valley in the light and was, in the uncomplicated and certain way that is the reward of a life well built, content. Winifred Doyle Slater taught school in Mill Creek until she was 63, and then retired from official teaching into the unofficial kind, which she had always considered the more important kind anyway. She was on the board of the school for 30 years. She wrote letters to the state education office with the same precise and effective clarity she had always brought to correspondence that needed to be effective. She read every book in the house at least twice, and some of them considerably more, and she bought more books every year, and the shelf that Jasper had built from North Slope timber in the first winter became 3 shelves and then 6, and the room that held them was the best room in the house, and everyone knew it. On the morning of their 35th wedding anniversary, which was November 1914, she made coffee at the table where they had always had it, and she sat across from him, and the light came in through the window the way it always had, and she looked at him with the same frank appraisal she had given him that first day when he rode past the schoolhouse steps. Except that 35 years of everything they had been through together had made the appraisal so deep and so certain that it was more like recognition than observation. He was looking at her with the same expression. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. Outside, the valley was cold and clear, the mountains white and certain on the horizon, exactly where they had always been. They drank their coffee, and the morning came on full and bright, and everything that had been built was still there, still standing, still true. Some things, made with care and chosen with full knowledge of the cost, simply hold. And this one had.